Welcome to Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello, everybody. This time we're joined by, first of all, Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen, whom we know already from several episodes. He's been a guest, the guy behind the platform Nordic Animism on YouTube and elsewhere in the social media sphere. And we're also joined by Sámi Kyrre Franck, who has joined us to talk about subjects relating to cultural appropriation. So welcome to the podcast, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Hi, people.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is going to be a fun one, but equally terrifying, I think, for everyone.
We are getting cancelled.
Oh, that was a joke. That was a joke. Don't cancel.
This is starting great.
It will be good fun. No, but before we get started, I do want to give a quick shout out to Ed Gamester's show that he put on the other day. I went to watch it, and it was fantastic. It was one of the best things I've seen in a long time. And I know he worked really hard on it. And also, there was a few people that went specifically because they heard Ed on the show, liked Ed, wanted to see his show. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to those people as well. You know, it's quite cool to know that people found something like that because me and you talk about random stuff sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I think it's really awesome that we are finally becoming a platform that can advertise for cool things and actually make people go to them.
Yeah.
So this is I've seen. Obviously, I couldn't be there myself because it's all the way over in England, but I've seen cool videos of it, and it looks like it was a really awesome show.
Yeah, I think he's wanting to hopefully take it to some festivals. So that would be really cool. I mean, I've never seen professional wrestling in person before. And I guess maybe when I was younger, I was one of those people who was like, oh, wrestling's fake. And then when I saw it, I was like, you know what? It doesn't have to make a bang. And they are athletes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's still fun, even though it's fake.
Yeah, it was like it was a hell of a lot of fun. He did really well with it. Yeah, I mean, let's jump into the episode, because I feel like we've got a lot to talk about, so let's not have any fluffing at the start of the episode like we may do normally, because I imagine we're going to run out of time regardless. So I think the best place to start is probably the reason why the episode got put together, and I guess there was your post, Rune, that I kind of saw, which was you were at the museum and there were a bunch of different things. That the Sami drums was one. And you made a post about how this was cultural appropriation and how they should be given back. And for me, I guess I never thought of the things in museums in that kind of way. And that's probably very naive of me, but I imagine there's a lot of people that also are in that position. And when I read it in your post, it made me then question myself on what I thought of things. Because on one hand, I was very much of the thought that I don't want these things to disappear from museums where I can go and see them, and I guess they're accessible and people can learn from them. But on the other hand, I could fully understand why some of these items should be given back to the cultures that created them and would enjoy them and also would be able to display them. So I felt very torn, and I ended up messaging Mathias asking his opinion on it. And his answer was, well, let's just put together an episode and find out, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, this actually started that I brought my kids to the. Oh, sorry, that's my phone.
That's the one making sure that you're saying it wrong.
That's when you know you got a hippie on the podcast. I'm just gonna mute this thing. No, I brought my kids to the National Museum, and this was about the time when there'd been a story circulating that Sami people from, I don't remember what part of Sámi, was contacting the Danish crown actually in order to have returned one specific drum, which I think was lent to them.
Kautokeino was the place.
Was it Kautokeino? Okay, yeah. And and I remember sort of during my education, I was good friends with the PhD student who was actually studying some stuff about the Sami drama and its contemporary meaning. And I remember seeing these debates and knowing that there's only like a very set amount of them left. Somebody wrote somewhere, I don't think it was you, Kyrre,
No.
it was somebody else who wrote that there was only like 2 of them actually displayed at museums in Norway. So when I'm passing by the National Museum, there are 4 of them hanging in kind of a corner in a montre, and they're like in this room together with a lot of Siberian shamanic paraphernalia, and the room is just covered with shamanic belts with like amulets hanging off them and like covered. And I was just thinking, it really struck me. I think perhaps the term cultural appropriation, I didn't use it quite correctly there, but it's certainly very abusive to cultural ownership. These objects are incredibly important, and the processes through which they were taken were violent, extremely oppressive, as if I know the story, the history correctly. So this was one side of it, but I want to mention the other side, which was a post that I made yesterday, and actually I only posthumously realized that it actually speaks a little bit into the same, and that was that I went out and appropriated Jewish culture in understanding North European culture. So I made a Hanukkah greeting where the Jewish lighting of candles in order to overcome the rupture in the Jewish connection between the Jews and their God. That is what it means. And they do this around this time of year. They have a lunisolar calendar like traditional Nordic calendar. And at this time of year, they light candles in order to overcome, like show their cultural resilience. They overcame the rupture in their tradition. So I kind of said, okay, let us think like the Jews, that we are overcoming ruptured tradition when we are lighting the candles for Christmas, which is also a very normal Nordic thing to do. So, and that particular post, it got really positive feedback on it. Well, also there were people who were like, Jews are bad and stuff like that, and have a problem with cultural mixing, of course. That then means that you can run block, ban, delete on some people. That's a nice little thing. I always feel this little glimpse of joy when I hear the silent scream of another fascist returning into the great dim silence of the Ginnungagap of the internet. But the thing was then that the positive reactions that I got from this transgression of culture, really, where I used a piece of Jewish culture to understand or to kind of inform a piece of Nordic culture. And people were like, thank you so much for this. This made me whole. One had this kind of formulation. And I really felt, man, that particular formulation, it's really stuck with me, broke my heart a little bit. Like that, there's a woman walking around feeling that she's not whole because she has part Nordic, part Jewish heritage. And that feels ruptured inside her. And I think that rupture, that lack of capacity to hold different backgrounds or to allow them to mix and transgress each other, and that is a really profoundly problematic thing to do to humanity. And so what I was basically thinking is that we need to be able to radically insist on giving the Sami back their drums, and we need to also radically insist on that woman over there not feeling unwhole because she has 2 different backgrounds. And those 2 things, when I see these debates, I don't see a lot of people who are able to sort of kind of hold in their mind that the tension or the possible contradiction between cultural exchange as a fundamental condition of being human and cultural ownership as something that we have to respect and insist on. Thank you very much.
I think that cultural exchange has existed since the dawn of time. We know that the people travel a lot more now than we thought they did for a long time, and especially here in Norway, you can see when we start talking about animism and shamanism, you see that cultural exchange from the Sami to the Norse population and vice versa. So I think cultural exchange, and especially when talking about animism, and because at least in Norway or Denmark and Sweden, they lost so much from, but for instance, the Sami people still have, well, we lost a lot of things too, but we still have, we have 400 years of knowledge that you didn't get to have. So
I also think that cultural exchange, and you might actually, from some perspective, you might actually say not only cultural exchange, but cultural appropriation, because, but it also defines about how we're actually going to talk about cultural appropriation, because I think we can get to that later, but I think that in order to be able to criticize it, we need to understand what kind of ownership some kind of culture is under. That's point one. Point two, we need to understand if the root culture is in any way damaged or devalued by the cultural exchange. If we have those two factors, and I'm not saying that's the the final result, but I think those two factors are important. But in fact, I think if we look at cultural exchange, it's just what it means. It means somebody taking somebody else's culture, making it theirs, and now they're using it. Then it's an absolute universal for almost all culture that you can point to. Like 70% of the language that we're speaking right now is culturally appropriated words. And there wasn't any process of consensus or anything like that. You know, that was just like a big messy flow of culture that made these things happen.
I think there's a lot of important points to consider here. If I remember that original post you made correctly, you had three items you were talking about. There were the Sámi drums, and there was a thing I can't remember, and then there was the Norwegian royal horn. What was the third thing again?
It was a mask. It was an Inuit mask.
Oh yeah, an Inuit mask. Yeah. So what I strongly agree with you that the presence of the Inuit mask and the Sámi drums in the Danish museum is incredibly problematic. But I don't have the same opinion about the Norwegian royal horn, and that has everything to do with the processes that have brought it to this location, right? And sure, I'm going to piss off a bunch of Norwegians now, but I'm okay with that because the situation is very different, right? We have, when it comes to in terms of Danish relations to Sámi, right? Back when Denmark and Norway were still locked in an imperial structure, right? That's a situation where we have a fundamental power imbalance between the Danish population and the Sámi populations in northern Scandinavia, right? And they are being forcefully Christianized, and also in so many ways oppressed, right? So that's a very, very specific problematic power situation, and that hasn't been addressed historically. The Danish Empire has, as far as I know, not really addressed our responsibility in that context. And now we have a situation where we have artifacts in Denmark from those populations that we have been part of oppressing, right? That's very important to keep in mind. I wouldn't say that that is necessarily the same situation when it comes to the Norwegian population in Norway, in the same way at least, and certainly not when it comes to the situation under which royal horn like that finds its way to Copenhagen in 1720 through Iceland. Like it's actually a curious journey that horn has taken. So there's something very important in terms of like understanding the material history and the process when it comes to these matters, and that is very difficult for a lot of people to also understand, because a lot of people don't have all those facts available to them, right? That's something that historians have, or people who carry the knowledge and history with them for different reasons, right? And remember why something has happened, right? I mean, we all have historical knowledge, and some people are sometimes charged with having more of it than others without necessarily being professional historians too. So that's something I think we should take into consideration when we're talking about cultural appropriation and what that really means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think we should maybe start off by trying to, I guess, put in a brief understanding to what culture is, because I think that maybe a lot of people might be confused or not sure like what we would class as maybe a culture, and then what appropriation of that culture may look like or class as. Just try and get some maybe ground ideas in there that we can work around, so we have a little bit of structure rather than kind of jumping all over here, there, and everywhere. Who wants to try and take that one? Because I know it's not me.
It's a kind of a long story, or it's hard to get in just a few minutes. But I would say that a culture is a lot of things. It's an identity marker. Like I'm wearing traditional clothes.
You are the fanciest dressed guest we've had on.
It's called a gakti. It's the traditional Sami clothes. And if another Sami saw me in this, he knew which area my family is from, and if they're really into it, they can actually see who made it also, from which family, because there are some differences, small differences from gakti to gakti and how they do things.
Just to jump in, I guess maybe a question that I just had come to mind is that's a beautiful garment to me. So if I wanted to buy one of those and then wear it, I assume that is some sort of appropriation. Now, where does that? I guess that's kind of an organic question that I had in my mind of where that would stand, and how would that maybe be perceived?
It would be perceived as an appropriation, and also imitating something you are not in the Sami community. As I said, this is an identity marker. It says where I'm from. It says which family I'm from, and there is a lot of other things that are significant. Am I married? Am I not married? Things like that, which Sami people can read into the garment. So they would be. I guess we all can agree that dressing up as a Native American is not a good thing to do, and it's kind of the same thing with a Sami garment. You need to be Sami to wear the Sami, at least the gakti.
But that's also because it carries so much more cultural import than simply just being something you wear. Like I'm wearing a Satyricon t-shirt right now. That's something that anybody can buy, and it just means that either you want to look black metal cool, or you like that type of music. That's it, right? But to create sort of an analogy to another cultural product that it's not problematic to wear. Let's think about, for instance, the Icelandic sweaters, right? They have a very distinct pattern. This is something that has been created culturally over time, but they don't have I mean, they very strongly signal Iceland. And you can buy them in all tourist stores in Iceland and all that stuff, right? And there's no problem in wearing them because they are a cultural product from a part of the world that freely makes this available to others. And they also don't have that all those layers of cultural meaning, right? If you're wearing an Icelandic sweater, you're not telling anybody that you're like, oh, I descend from this particular family in Vatnafjörður or something like that, right? So that's a very different different context, but a similar situation where we can see that there's a cultural product, right?
I think that the one thing for me is that you would get a lot of people that maybe would say, where does the appreciation stop and the appropriation start? In a sense of the people may want to buy the garment because they want to appreciate it, they love it, they really think it's a beautiful thing, they have the utmost respect for it in all manners that it should be, but obviously that would still be maybe seen as a negative thing, even though the intent is very much a positive. And I guess that's one thing I've always maybe been a little confused about, is that maybe people do want to own these things because they just love the culture, they think it's amazing, they think it's a beautiful thing, but then obviously it can have the negative connotation, which is why maybe some people get caught up in it because they don't know where that line is, I guess.
I would say that an important factor in this is power. If you have a cultural group that has been exposed to marginalization, then, and like the Sami, the Gakti is an expression of Sami identity, partly as a manifestation of those processes. I would assume, Kyrre, you can tell us any more about this, through which the Sami has been oppressed. Now, if that's not really the case with the Icelandic sweater has never been used in that way, then there's a different thing going on. This is also why I would maintain that there's a problem in the Norwegian king's horn, because it is a power symbol. It's a power symbol. It might have come to Denmark in completely legitimate ways. That might also be the case for the Sami drums. They might have been sold from Nuaidit who converted to Christianity. We don't know, but there might not be. But there are many cases of this. Totem poles that were legitimately sold and bought, and so on.
The royal horn is a royal heirloom. It belongs to the royal family.
And it's also a symbol of Norwegian state unity, and
which would have included Denmark in 1387. So
it doesn't anymore. Like royal regalia, they are symbols of power. When the Brits go conquer the Ashanti, what is the first thing they do? They go in and they take the Ashanti throne, bring it to England, and stick it in a museum. That is a power demonstration of imperial power that's going on there. So
that's not the historical case between Norway and Denmark.
No, but Norway is independent now, and this is one of their only symbols of state unity and power that is even there. And I think there can be so many details in the history that mixes that in different ways. But I still think anyway, that's just my opinion. But
it's actually quite important, because like you're equating British conquest with a much more complicated process, right? So the Norwegian royal horn is a very complicated process of intermarrying royal families, where, like, historically we've had a situation going back and forth since the late 900s. Right, where you have a king in Denmark who's then a king in Norway too for a bit, and then a Norwegian king who's then the king in Denmark for a bit, and going back and forth like that.
And then the Swedes came.
And then the Swedes come, and it's like it's a much more complicated process, and that's really, really important, actually, right?
So if the Yelling Stone was in Sweden because of a similar process, or a similar really important symbol for the Danish sense of state unity, would you think that then it would not be reasonable to say, okay, the first copy of Saxo Grammaticus or the Gunnestrup Cauldron, like a piece of symbolism on that level, like if the royal horn has been a Danish royal regalia, it wouldn't be in a national museum. It wouldn't be in the vault at Rosenborg. It would be part of the crown jewels because it's a royal regalia. And I think, and I agree with you, there are differences in this history. And I think a lot of your perspective on Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic relations are important. I just still think that having a royal regalia symbolizing the state unity of a different country, keeping it in the imperial. Okay,
there are also Swedish aristocrats featured on that horn, which
but,
again also makes it interesting and complicated. No, I get what you're saying, and I understand the reasonability of it all. I'm not sure that I still agree. And if the Yellingstone had found itself in Sweden, I would not give a shit, honestly.
I was just thinking that when I said it. Perhaps I'd be happy. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's also because I am fundamentally, and that is something to do with this this concept of mixed cultural background. I myself have a lot of mixed cultural background in many different ways, having lived in Greenland for an extended period of time as a child and so on. I could not care less about national histories and national cultures in that sense, because it means nothing to me. I'm like, in that sense, I don't have an allegiance, right?
And I feel you very much with that. I have different but very strong issues with nationalism of my own. I come from these sort of cultural nationalist kind of background, not radical, but like these Grundtvigians kind of, and so I follow you in that. However, I would say we should leave that for them to decide. It's actually not our business.
I think it's probably quite interesting that because I don't particularly have any national pride or just like Mathias, and same with you, Rune, but I imagine, Kyrre, you're completely opposite. You have very much a deep cultural pride when it comes to your Sami heritage. And do you think that's
Definitely.
Do you think that's maybe down to the fact that us three kind of come from probably countries that have had empires? We've been in the power position, I guess, whereas maybe the Sami have been on the receiving end of that. So you have more of maybe a deeper cultural pride, whereas we don't necessarily have that because it's been mixed, I guess. Is that the right word? I'm not sure if it is, but
I think that a lot of societies and nationalities had the same kind of pride and connectedness I do have into my culture. I'm also Norwegian, so the Norwegians, the Norse population, not the Vikings, but the Norse population, because Viking was an occupation. They kind of lost this. I don't know if you can call it cultural ownership, because it was taken away from them 1,000 years ago. But I think it was the same pride back then, into not like a nationalist pride, but the pride to be and a cultural understanding and a cultural connectedness to things, and a cultural ownership. And when I'm saying cultural ownership, I don't mean like I own the Sami culture. I'm a Sami, not I don't represent the Sami people in any other way than just being a Sami. But if my definition of cultural ownership to the Sami culture is, it means that I can be a part of it, and I can participate in forming what Sami culture is.
I also think it's important to not equate sort of appreciation of culture with nationalism. I think that, and this is something that I felt very much living in Sweden, that which is a culturally richer country than Denmark. It has this huge array of different groups that are indigenous to the place, and I would say that the nationalist ideology is not a friend of the culture of that land. It's actually reductive to the culture of that land. It actually wants to see only one modality of what we know as Swedish as the norm, rather than this amazing plurality of men and like 3 different kinds of Sami and Skogsfinnar and so many kinds of Swedes that they barely know how many there are themselves, and people who are more Norwegian, people who are more Danish, and so on. And I think that's the approach, the appreciation of culture. I almost see it as in opposition to nationalism, actually.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in opposition to nationalism, and I mean, there have been European thinkers throughout history who have tried to work out how do multiple identities exist under the same, in the same territory, under the same ruler, right? And Johannes Ewald, a Danish writer, is an example of that from the 1700s, like writing about the identities in Schleswig-Holstein and Denmark and Norway, right? And like creating some kind of I don't know what you can call it, imperial multi-identity out of that, right? So that has happened over time, like looking at like what is this country that I live in, and how do we interact and react with one another. You know, we Danes, we have plenty of examples, by the way, of stuff that has wound up in other countries. We have a dead king lying in northern Germany, for instance. I don't know what our queen thinks about having her ancestor in Germany. I mean, I know that back when that part of now Germany ended up being solidly German in 1920, it almost led to a war. The king was very close to actually performing a state coup. So that tells you a little bit about how some people have very strong identities tied to that as well, right? So
and I actually think one thing you're pointing out there, Mathias, is important. That is, I actually think that we can learn something from empires, because empires, they have this idea that the plurality of peoples that call themselves subjects to the empire kind of affirms the greatness of the empire. And that means that they are sometimes rather pluralist. Like what you see in Scandinavia with the transition from monarchies and into nationalism is increased pressure on minorities, attacks on Jews in Denmark in the late 19th century, and through the 20th century we have the minority groups in northern Scandinavia suddenly becomes a problem in the way that I'm not sure they were before in the same way. But and like,
I mean, a lot of the Norwegian policies that have been so detrimental to the Sami come directly from intentions to strengthen the Norwegian border towards the east, right, towards Sweden and Finland and Russia, right? So because the Sami have been nomadic, moving back and forth across the border, that was seen as a problem, right? So they had to become sedentary. Yeah.
Just jump in on that point, Kyrre. I was wondering if you could maybe give a quick, and I'm sure it's not a quick thing to answer, rundown on kind of what happened to the Sami, I guess, at the hands of maybe the Norwegian. Because as a Brit, and I assume the American listener as well, it's not something that we particularly know about. We learn about, so it would be really interesting to hear kind of what it was, I guess, that happened
A quick resume of that would be, well, most of us know what happens to the Native American people and to other indigenous people around the world as well. And much of the same happened in Norway with marginalization. We were taken, our language was taken away. There were boarding schools where they wasn't allowed to speak Sami. Their religion was taken away. Their drums was burned, and the Sami shamans Noidi was burned or killed. Well, it was horrendous. There was a lot of suffering and marginalization of the Sami people, and they were kind of forcefully assimilated to be Norwegians.
When was this?
It kind of started when in the 15, 16, or a little bit earlier, when the missionaries came to the north. And started, and the missionaries was used as kind of a tool to force the Sami people to be Norwegian.
I mean, yeah, we have from the Reformation a push from the Danish crown to make sure that everybody is now Protestant, right? Which leads to, for instance, uprisings in both in Norway and in Iceland as well.
Yeah.
And then very forceful missionary activity up in Sámi, and this gets even worse in the 1700s. And then when Norway transitions to a personal union with Sweden in 1814, that's when we see this very strong and often kind of vitriolic, I'd say, push for establishing a Norwegian national identity in the same way that we see in other countries, and that's when it gets really rough, right?
Yeah, and this well, it kind of continues up until today, but it definitely continued until the 70s, 80s, 1980s. So it's quite a long stretch of history.
Yeah, I mean it's very recent. Events, right? And nowadays we see more of like a positive, general positive attitude in Norway, I think, towards Sámi, but you also still see situations where, what was it, in 2018 there was a reindeer herder who was told to cull his half of his herd because it was herding the tundra. Like, I mean, these animals live off of the tundra, right? So that had to go to the international court, right?
Yeah. And there is this big wind farms going on right now, and mining activities that takes away the grazing land from the reindeer herders. So kind of the Sami people in all of Scandinavia and in Russia as well. We're still on the losing end of things.
Yeah, yeah.
That's it's really interesting, but also very, very sad. And it's such a shame that things like that happened, and I guess probably still happen. We can hope that these things disappear, but I'm sure that they never truly do.
I think an interesting counterpoint to this is the actually the pre-Christian relations or relation making between Sami and Nordic peoples. And I mean, of course, we should also always be a little bit cautious when we're creating nostalgic images of how fraternal everything was in the past. But at least there's this Norwegian scholar, I've got the name right now, but she's talking about the kinship metaphors that used to govern the relations between Nordic peoples or Germanic Nordic peoples and Sami peoples. And part of that is that the Sami is inscribed in creation myths. So you have Nordic creation myths that talk about how Norway was formed, basically, and it is as if there's a Sami element of that, and Norwegian kings later took great care in their sagas to emphasize, oh, I descend from Sami, or a part of my ancestry is Sami, and that's clearly a way of saying I am a legitimate king of this land. Obviously, it's a power language, it's a royal power language, but it's important to note that that was apparently a way of making a legitimate power language at that point in the Middle Ages. So there's
a really important historical element of this actually in the Snæfríður, Harald Harfagri's first wife, I guess, in a sense. Like, the reason that she's there is because the history writer, whether it was Snorri Sturluson, that's another discussion, but whomever was writing this saga could not deny that connection, that was a real connection, and that, you know, is quite interesting because it means that there was a general understanding of a interconnectedness there in the royal family,
which is of course because people in that age did not think like the kind lady on my Instagram post, oh damn, I feel that I have trouble reconciling these sides of myself. No, it was what do you say, a resource to have a plurality of background in that way. And I think that when we talk about how traditional knowledge works, I think that real traditional knowledge would work in these sort of exchanges and interplays. And this is why, like, when I'm communicating from an animist perspective, and which is why I sometimes get a bit of heat, because I you know, I have to say in exchange is actually important, and that's can conflict with the ideas of cultural appropriation. But I don't know, should we consider cultural ownership, what that is, and how we should actually think of that? Just
yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because I think it comes on to what I said to you earlier, Rune, about it's almost when you have an artist who puts something on Facebook and kind of puts it out there for the world, you sort of lose ownership of that piece of art in the moment. It becomes everybody's art because people can say what they want about it. They can steal it if they want. And I guess that's almost like culture, because when you put it out there, you will get people who either look at it negatively or positively. And the people who look at it positively may personally identify with it and want to adopt part of that. And it is that kind of mixture of what ownership is. And when you own something, do you then say you can't have it, or do you decide who can and who can't? It is a very complex topic.
It is, and there are parts of culture that are very heavily owned, like, and I think you find that in a lot of indigenous culture. They find that knowledge will typically be bound in, for instance, relation, a specific kin group or totemic group that owns this knowledge, only supposed to be communicated very tight, specific situations. And if you take that kind of knowledge and you just blow it into some other context, that from the perspective of that animist perception, that can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to the knowledge. It can be dangerous to the originators of that knowledge. It can be dangerous to the people who get in touch with that knowledge. And that's just like, from the animist perspective, we haven't even started talking about what the identitarian implications are of it.
I would really love to hear what Kyrre has to say about cultural ownership.
Well, I kind of answered it earlier on, but and it's a very tough topic to go into, because do I, as a Sami, have a right to say that you can't do Sami shamanism? in my opinion, no, I don't. If you want to do Sami shamanism, or Nueduoda, as it's called, that's totally okay. But don't portray a Sami person, or you're a Danish guy or a British guy or American guy, but you're doing Sami shamanism, which is okay. I can't claim that Sami shamanism, or which is a religion, isn't open to anyone who wants to do that. But in the same time, I think cultural ownership also means that I have a kind of a right to say that this is part of Sami shamanism, whereas you, as a non-Sami person, can say that you can't take yoga and call it Sami shamanism. Sami, yeah, Sami shamanistic yoga or something like that.
Have a Sami shamanic dream catcher is hanging on the wall outside the.
I mean,
that was a joke. That was a joke. Don't cancel my.
Canceled now, man.
I would assume though that the people within a particular culture wouldn't necessarily agree on what ownership was themselves as well. Obviously, Kyrre, you may think one thing, and then somebody else may be happy replicating items and selling them to bring money back into the culture, whereas you may then think negatively on that. So exactly. it's that much of a complex issue that it's not a case of that just one person can say this is right, this is wrong, because I guess anybody who is from that culture has the right to be able to dictate what they feel should do with the culture, which I guess is also maybe confusing for people who may buy certain items from indigenous people who maybe feel it's okay to sell them, and then you get other people within the culture saying, well, that's not okay, and you kind of get confused. He's like, well, I bought it from the right place, or what they consider to be the right place, but then also then are told that it's a bad thing. So it is such a complex issue.
Yeah, that's an important issue that any human context will have different systems and tensions inside it, and that's universal. I don't think that. I mean, there is culture where you can actually say this culture is very easy to see if it's owned or not, like Northwest Coast American raven tails. These sometimes you have specific tales that are so owned by specific families that a grandfather will disown, or father would disown his son because the son sold the right to narrate this story to another man. That is how heavy the ownership of that piece of knowledge is, right? So you see, blowing that kind of stuff out on the internet is a very intense violation of that kind of knowledge. So stuff like that does exist, and you also have initiatory knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that we, with the here in the US in particular, but also generally across Europe, I would say in the Western world, with the fascination with Native Americans that begins in the 80s, right? You see a lot of indigenous knowledge being disseminated to a broader public, sometimes by good faith actors, and also sometimes by straight up charlatans, right? And that has become a real fundamental problem to indigenous cultures in especially in the US and Canada right now. And they're trying to work out, well, how do we exist in this with this surrounding culture that in so many ways is suppressing us and taking away our basic livelihood in so many ways, and at the same time also is like spiritually fascinated. And you know what, like living in a southwestern state like Colorado, and you know, you could go to places like New Mexico or you know, Nevada or Arizona, and you'll find these white people all over the fucking place with like their Indian fascinations, right? And it's like it's really heavy. Like it is encompassing as a culture here. So you really get a very like first-hand kind of impression of how harmful it can actually be when you have people who come from an outside culture who are appropriating also in a personal context, right? But the question is also, how did that stuff end up in their hands, become available to them in the first place, and how are we now going to mitigate that situation later on, right? And those are similar issues, I think, that indigenous peoples in Scandinavia also facing, because you do have the same kind of like romanticizing, and you know, every other descendant of Scandinavian immigrants over here, you know, who wants to have some kind of like spiritual claim or something like that, is like, yeah, my ancestor this and that was Sámi, right? So like you get that a lot too.
The noble savage.
The noble savage, exactly, right?
I also think that this attraction to indigenous culture, I think it's important to. I totally agree. You know, it's super pathological in so many ways, the way it comes, ways expressed. But I also think that it is important to perhaps acknowledge that it comes from a place of people seeking land connectedness, and that is sort of the root of it. People wouldn't be so fascinated by Native Americans. Like there's here in Northern Europe, it's absolutely crazy. Like there's a whole culture of people in Germany who they have powwows and they dress up as Native Americans and they dance around and in this their
It's
German
so weird,
imagination
so
of it's so bloody weird. And but I think that this fascination, I think it comes from realizations of lost connectedness, and then the image of culture that, for good or bad reasons, sometimes good reasons, come to represent that connectedness, becomes attractive to people.
Absolutely. And I would add to this, over here in the US, you know, actual substantial cultural identity has been replaced by race, so that, you know, I'm not Danish, I'm a white guy, right? So I don't have that cultural background anymore as like an immigrant in the US. That's how this has been has developed now too, right? So that means that so many white people, they only have capitalism as a culture, which is I mean, you could see it. It's a big loss to these people, right? And that's why they're looking for these alternatives, right? In indigenous cultures.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was going to actually ask whether you think that maybe you get this big interest in indigenous peoples because, I guess, so a lot of Europe lost the cultural identity with Christianity. I guess it became one single thing.
Actually, it's much more industrialization.
Really?
Like, yeah. Christianity, of course, shifts cultural identity, but it doesn't erase the cultural identity that these local groups have around in Europe. Absolutely not. You know, it overlays, and there's a long history of going back and forth. Actually, you can see like the resurgence of you know, ancient pagan rituals, or semi-pagan, or you know, interpreted as pagan throughout Christian history in Europe. No, what really takes away identity for Europeans and white North Americans is industrialization, and all the processes, the economic processes and production processes that come with that. Because all of a sudden you have these huge migrating groups of people that move between cities where they can find jobs and so on, or try to find land that they can farm and so on.
I guess
that takes it away.
I guess just thinking about it now, is it actually a loss of culture, or is it just a change into a different culture? Because obviously American culture today, when we go 200 years in the future, people are going to look back on it as its own culture, and we might describe it now as we've lost a past culture. But I guess culture is it's a living, it's its own living organism, that it changes, it moves, it evolves from 100 years to the next, and probably even shorter than that. It will always change and adapt depending on what the popular things are at the time as well.
You're totally right. I mean, of course, this is a culture. People have culture, you know. They always have culture. They don't exist without culture. But there is a very strong sense of loss of culture in Western white populations. That goes for, you know, people in Germany. It goes for people here in North America as well. You know, and this is something that we can historically see has been happening over the last 200 years at least. It's like hearkening back to ancient days and bringing back the medieval period in statues and buildings and those kinds of things, like as if they had lost culture, right?
Is it a loss of culture, or is it just?
It's a sense of loss.
Or is it just an interest in a different culture, and they go, I'd like that now, so I want to go back to that, because everyone still has their own culture that they exist in today. It's just they may be interested in something else and go, okay, well, I want to try and follow that with the pagan or the heathen. You've not kind of lost your new culture.
I think it might be a loss of immaterial cultural heritage, the spirituality of thing. I think that's the main thing that a lot of modern people feel that they lack. And I get a lot of feedback also on that when I talk to other people that when they get introduced to spirituality, or it doesn't matter what it is, yoga or shamanism, but they it kind of fills a void in them.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good point. Yeah.
I also think that you can, I know to speak for myself, like I just love other cultures. It doesn't matter what it is, I just enjoy learning about it. I love the artwork, the things that they create. I find it extremely fascinating. So I guess I never want it to be seen as a negative thing to enjoy those things and want to enjoy those things, but also sometimes it feels like you have to tread on careful ground because you don't know what you can and can't enjoy, I guess.
I think humans are inherently interested in each other.
So it should be.
And because that's just like, you know, if you go into Cambodia and into the mountains and you found an ethnic group living there, and you start telling them about humans who are in a different way, they're going to be like, wow, that's bloody interesting. They're going to be saying that in Khmer or whatever language they use, you know, but and yeah.
I think a point maybe we'll get to shortly is that we have to try and find, I guess, a middle ground, because if you equally go to the extreme of the other side and everybody just goes, this is my culture, this is mine, you can't enjoy it, you also go down a very dangerous path of sort of nationalism, and it can become become very dangerous. So you have to find this balance, because some people, we know people who go, well, this is mine. It's certainly when it comes to like white culture, I guess this is mine. You can't enjoy it because you look different or think different. And we need to avoid that, as well as also protecting the rights for indigenous culture as well.
I think it's extremely important. Like I'm communicating about Nordic animism, and I am actually culturally unambiguous myself, as far as I know. My ancestors never really moved around. So I guess I could pose myself as culturally pure and super authentic and stuff like that. And perhaps I'm doing that a little bit with my long hair and my Viking name and whatever the flip. But this is also part of the reason that it's important for me to take the other position, to say no, because that image is in itself, I think this image is in itself something other. When people in North America, like Mathias is saying, are fascinated by Native Americans, that's because it represents, like Kyrre is saying, a spirituality in the image of something that's exotic and other. It's exactly the same reason that people are fascinated by Vikings. Exactly the same. And I actually feel that it's a problem when white Americans who might be kind and respectful people, who believes in equality in all kinds of ways, when they approach North European cultural heritage from that motivation, I kind of feel, so is that like, should we be sort of subject to this inherent racialization in that? Now, I'm not saying this a lot to people because I don't feel that I have the right, exactly like Kyrre, I don't feel I have the right to go and be a huge judge of why people are approaching this or that, and that would, and also people move between culture and between cultural spaces in all kinds of curly and weird ways that aren't necessarily consistent with what I would find or what we would find as ethically appealing, but I still sort of sense that it's a little bit of a problem that Nordic heritage is popular because people are confined in racializing, partly because they can't become Rastafarians or Hare Krishna, whatever hippies used to become, anymore, because that is considered, that is very heavy judgments are laid on that.
Oh, that's a good point, because I see it regularly through Horns of Odin, because we use non-white models in some of our pictures. We get the amount of comments that I get of people saying, well, that's cultural appropriation. A black man shouldn't be wearing a t-shirt with a Nordic symbol on, or like we get it. I numerous times we've had that, and it almost feels it's that because they hear that other cultures may use cultural appropriation against them, they then go, well, this is my chance to try and shout it back, even whether it fits or not. It's like it's my opportunity to use that term back. And it makes no sense.
But that's the problem of racialization of culture. This is why I maintain, living in one of the most racialized places on the planet, the United States of America. I maintain I'm Danish more than anything else. I mean, yeah, sure, I have white skin, but so does Kyrre, and the Sami have been racialized too. In the colonization period in Scandinavia. So you can also have racializations happening between different kinds of whites, right? And the same with different kinds of black peoples. It happens also on the African continent, which is actually
except me, I'm pure Aryan. I'm very Indo-European.
Didn't you just say that?
I'm joking.
That you had some Sami heritage?
Excuse me?
Did you just say that you had some Sami heritage?
No, I said no. Actually, well, I actually lived in Karasjok, and I took a high school B level in Northern Sami, but it's a long time ago.
But see, I mean, explicating these things, right? So the Sami history of becoming a recognized indigenous people, right, also went through the subject of race. The Sami were not, initially accepted as an indigenous group by other indigenous groups because they're white, right? Mm-hmm. So that tells you everything about how these ideas of race so often influence how we think about things, and that needs to stop, because race and racism was invented to separate people in these colonies, right? that America, for instance, is and was, and then has become a colonial empire itself. So what we have these curious situations where people think about cultural exchange and ethnic relations based on race, right? And like I was, I was in a class on Sunday about this was about labor, maternal labor and giving birth and all that stuff, because we have a kid coming along, right? And somebody asked the nurse who was giving that class, well, what do they do in Africa, right? And that tells you everything about how these things are sometimes conceptualized, right? It's like Africa, well, which part? What people? What are you talking about, right? Like, but this is because that person, with good intentions, by the way, was simply like trying to figure out, well, what do people that they consider more natural, right, do out there in the world. And so Africa is like the location for more natural people, for some bolder hippie, right? And so this is the problem that we're dealing with, right? Essentially, that we think in, or people tend to think in these boxes about everything when it comes to other ethnicities out there in the world. And that really stifles the possibility of talking about proper cultural exchange as opposed to cultural appropriation, right?
I think the reason for that is probably because it's like this episode, we've been going an hour and 10 minutes and we've got no definitive answers. And that kind of just shows how complex of an issue this is. And probably that there isn't a definitive answer on any of it, because everything is always changing. So people try and put them into these neat boxes so they can understand it the best that they can.
It's because this stuff requires that you think, and you think hard,
Mm-hmm.
and you employ a will to try to understand that other person that you're interacting with, right?
But I think also people at the minute as well are just scared to move left or right, because if they go one way, they're wrong, and if they go the other way, they're wrong. So they kind of just stick and stay still and go, okay, well, if I don't do anything, then I'm going to be okay. Because it can be a point where you just feel like you're going to get shouted at whether you do or you don't, rather than maybe, for example, if I bought one of the garments that you're wearing here,
but you could buy it, just don't wear it.
No, but that's okay. But what
in fact, I have a PayPal account here.
just use that as an example. I could do that with all the best intentions, and maybe I take a picture of me in it, I put it on, and I take a photo of me, put it online. But what would happen is, rather than people then explain why that's wrong, it would be a case of you would get an inundated with people saying you're a wanker, you're this, you're that, you're all the things under the sun. And it may be done with all the innocence, just because of a lack of understanding. And yes, people may say you should have researched it first, and maybe you should, but we also should be maybe a little bit more understanding with each other, and not everything is done with malice, and go, okay, well, this is why that's wrong, and then try and explain from that point, rather than just jumping down the throat, because that's people then get scared to do anything.
I think the cultural appropriation, the word is, people are maybe a bit quick to use it.
It's become...
It might aggravate some by saying that, but when I think also we have to separate what is cultural, when does cultural appropriation happen, and what does it mean actually, when does cultural exchange go into appropriation?
Mm-hmm. I think also the
hallelujah. I so enjoy your imposing indigeneity while you're saying that, Kyrre.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. I think it's important that it is as if people haven't really the tools to make that distinction, and that kind of it blows the concept of cultural appropriation all over the place. And when I see people using it, I feel, and this might just because they're mostly sometimes shouting it at me because I don't know, mentioned the word shamanism or something like that. But I feel that it's the reason has something to do with racializing, that humans have to be unambiguous in that way. And I actually also think that capitalism plays a role. The idea that culture is sort of looked at these kind of objects that are placed on shelves.
Commodity.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we all can agree that that's a negative thing. When you get, I think, Mathias, you spoke about it on one of the earlier shows of one of the big companies taking Navajo designs and then printing them out for personal gain. I think we all can agree that that's definitely a bad thing. If those designs should be, if they want to be sold by the Navajo or any indigenous cultures, they should be sold for benefit for that culture, and the money should go back into that. And Kyrre,
I think just to add comments, that I think that was the origin of that particular case, was the origin of the term cultural appropriation. This is what was being argued, that what we're dealing with here is a corporation that is culturally appropriating Navajo designs and making profit over it, and none of it goes to the Navajo nation. And that has everything to do with transaction in a capitalist economy, right? Which, is very different from an individual doing something, either, using elements of another culture to create their own spiritual practice, or wearing clothes or something like that. That's a very different context, and sometimes that's problematic, and sometimes it's more borderline, whether or not it's problematic. And that really comes down to the disposition of the individual who is looking at it too, right? Like hairstyles, for instance, have sometimes, and jewelry for that matter, right? That have been I'm not going any deeper into details about any of that, but that have been called out in different contexts as cultural appropriation. And then you can ask yourself, well, with some of them, I'm not sure that we're really dealing with that. But that's, again,
I think
discussion, right?
I think the worst cases of cultural appropriation criticism, the worst cases, there are cases where the criticism is extremely legitimate, but there are cases where the criticism itself is in fact an appropriative process. And I think that one example of this might be an example of this. No, I know. Then we're going outside the Nordic area. Let me leave that. No, we had an example that we shared in the chat. That was some sort of outright racist Viking nostalgic people who had something that looks like some male strippers who were wearing boxer shorts while they was looking super Viking.
Is it possible to post it in the chat, the picture?
We totally should.
You guys have to see this.
And that was a claim. The claim that was there was that these I'm just going to see if I can find it and see if I can post it in there.
If we send it, if you can send it to Shan, I don't know, Mathias, if you can pull it, you can pop it up on the screen so people can see it. But just to, I think the claim was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong whilst you're looking for it. I think it was the idea behind it was that the Vikings came up with the haka, and then the sort of island communities, the Pacific sort of island cultures, then stole and appropriated the haka for themselves from the Vikings, which is a bonkers idea. They've also given this dance a name on this meme, I guess.
The Gunnar dance or something like that.
which actually it actually keeps up the sort of male stripping, sort of porny kind of theme almost. Gunnar dance. It sounds a little bit like something a little bit.
Gunnar, that's just a goofy dude from Scandinavia. I don't know if we can see it there. That's what it looks like.
I'm gonna put it. I'm gonna put it in the chat. Let me see.
Well, I mean, so there's something to be said here for a very sinister background for claiming these kinds of things, and that is the actually rooted in the origins of New Age, right? Like New Age spiritualities have their origin in primarily Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, a very racist piece of literature written in the late 19th century, and all her material was pretty racist. Basically claiming that there was like this original race of people who were like very white and all that stuff, and everybody descends from them, and those who aren't white, they are then like degenerated versions of those original races. And this is where the whole Aryan myth comes into play, as like these white Northern Europeans, which they were not, right? And so what really lies at the heart of this New Age claim is that the original spirituality, original culture comes from these white people up north, right? And then has like precipitated down across the globe, and some other peoples around, they can more or less well do it, properly replicate it, and some don't at all, and all that stuff. It's a really weird system of being a total douche, honestly.
And by the way, that idea is
I just wanted to say that is also kind of at the root here of like claiming that, the haka that the Maori are doing it originally comes from Vikings. That's just a bunch of Viking bros who would really like to have had something like that from Scandinavia, and now they're sitting there coming up with that racist crap.
I mean,
there are white occultists today who claim the following. They claim that the Haitian religion voodoo was really a white cultural product that belonged to the sunken Atlantis and was then guarded in that form in Haiti. Now, part of the absolute ridiculous nature of this is absolutely ludicrous. But part of it is, of course, the claim that Black people could not make something as evidently beautiful and brilliant as voodoo. It has to have been white, and that has been a common theme in. And note again how the appropriation accusation is actually instrumental in the attempt to take. And I think you actually see that sometimes also from what you might call the left wing, that there is an accusation of appropriation. And the example I didn't want to mention before was the now just throwing it out, that's the Dia de los Muertos, which is the way that people talk about Dia de los Muertos, I think, which started as a mix between some Catholic and some indigenous Mexican culture. It was then appropriated by Mexican nationalism. It became a Mexican thing, and then it kind of moving into North America. But the appropriation accusation on that is, I think, is a way of imposing ownership on parts of culture that are extremely fluid and mobile between cultural groups, and anybody can see that if you take the time to look at a Wikipedia article about Dia de los Muertos. It's extremely evident,
And all of that comes, by the way, as a result of the American racialization of this huge group that is called Latinos and Hispanics, right, over here, which is like so many different people from so many different places with so many different ethnic and racial backgrounds and linguistic differences and all that stuff. But what it really means here is like you come from south of the border, right? So that has everything to do with a very specific American cultural context right now, right? And not so much with what is actually going on in Mexico.
There's one thing I want to touch on before we wrap up. And I guess that's the question of what do we do with all these things that are sat in museums that have ended up there from, I guess, being appropriated or taken by force. And I guess I want to come to you, Kyrre, first to get your opinion on that. And just before, I guess my thought is split. I don't really know. I guess for one thing, it would be good to give all these things back, but on the other hand, I think would it be more worthwhile to
your island would be lighter.
Oh, it would be. It certainly would be. But also, I guess, or on the other hand, do you make sure that maybe plaques are put up that explain the true history behind these items, so that then they get the recognition they deserve and people understand where they come from? Because I guess everybody, I still want to be able to see these wonderful items. And I guess more eyes are going to be on them when they're in the London Museum rather than maybe up at the north of Norway, as kind of selfish as that may sound. But more people are going to see it kind of in the London Museum. So do you put a plaque on and say, this is what it is, this is how it got here, and you accept and almost own the dark past behind it, but then you shine appreciation to the culture that it came from through that, and hopefully bring eyes to it? Or do you apologize and hand it back, but then limit maybe the amount of people that find the culture?
There is a very easy solution to that. You can make a copy of the drums and still have it exhibit. But the drums...
Why did I think of that? I just went on like a 2-minute rant. I should have just thought of that.
But the drums in themselves, they are a very important part of Sami spirituality. It's a Sami identity marker, so it's a part of our identity. And secondly, when does a theft become a property? These drums, especially the drums we were speaking about in the beginning, was taken away from Anders Paulsen, was his name. It was forcefully taken away from him, and he was then killed by a knife. But he was probably, if he weren't killed by a knife, he was probably going to be burned. So when does a theft become a property? If I steal something from you, your T-shirt or something, or your whiskey,
Hey. T-shirt's all right.
Don't get any ideas.
You get your eyes off of
I knew I was pushing some buttons there. Is it mine after 100 years? Is it mine after 200 years?
Well, that's a brilliant point, which is one other part of what I was wondering, is at what point do you go back to and say, okay, this is the point we're deciding everything after this goes back? Because obviously we have items that will have swapped hands maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 many more times. That's not the best English in the world, many more. But items that have been swapped and changed hands so often, from one to another, given to somebody else. And then at what point do you trace that back to its origin? And is it even possible with some things to trace it back to where it's meant to be?
That's a good point. I mean, Mathias might have a point with the horn that perhaps it's too far back, too convoluted in history. Yeah,
I mean, there's a couple of things to consider, right? One is which I think is really important. Are there people who are still hurt by this today? That's always a question to ask in this regard, right? And with the Sami drums, that's definitely the case, and that's with most of the material in the British Museum, also in the Danish National Museum for that matter. Like, all the sealskin thongs that we've stolen from Greenland, like, what the hell? What is that about? Like, you go into a room and it's like thongs, sealskin thongs, tie a wall. Like, there's also a lot of other Inuit artifacts. They should be returned. Of course, it should be returned, because you know what? Local cultures, right, having their own museums if they want to, like having their own agency in all of this, right? That is going to benefit them. You're
Yeah.
going to be a tourist in northern Norway looking at those Sami drums, or in Greenland looking at sealskin thongs, if the Inuit in Greenland decide that they want to display them, right? And that's really, really important to consider in this regard, that by returning these objects, you're also contributing to establishing institutions, legitimate institutions of identity and power in those places where they came from, right? So I say, yeah, bring it all back, and better do it yesterday than now.
But then would you not get maybe two people who then argue within a certain culture, or maybe even more, who then go, okay, well, I want it. When it comes back, I want it. And then you may get another person who's like, well, no, actually, I want it. And then you get this big argument and probably legal battles over who owns it.
There are official institutions in place to decide these things and take care of them. And also, let's also keep in mind that museums across the world lend out items all the time. So, for instance, if these drums are returned to Sámi, and then after a process of deciding what to do with them and how to handle them, and what import they have to Sami culture. Right? Maybe at some point there's a central authority that decides, well, we can lend it out to another museum to look at, or we can send a replica, as you were pointing out, Kyrre. Like, I mean, that the agency and the sovereignty should be in the hands of the people who have created them and who have relations to the items.
I think it's all about in what level were these things exchanged, under what circumstances were these things exchanged, and also about culture. What if two cultures meet on the same playing field, on a level surface, so to speak? Then there's exchange. In the minute one of the cultures has above the other culture in some kind of way, has some kind of power, as Rune mentioned in the beginning, then that's when we start to get into the gray area.
Yeah, I think so. To be fair, I think Frederick has a good point in the chat of what do you do with war bounties of things that do come from war. Obviously, you may have, I'm sure that somebody's grandfather has a Luger that they picked up from a German soldier sat at home during World War II. What is that? What do you do with that?
Well, so there's a couple of things to I would say that shifts the balance with these things. Right? Kyrre, you were just pointing this out, the power imbalance between Sami and Danes. There is a there's a structural one present right now. Sami do not have their own territory in the sense of a country that they own and are fully sovereign masters in, right? They have their own territory that exists within the borders of actually multiple other countries, right? And that is a very different power situation than the one between Denmark and Norway, for instance. Like Denmark and Norway are two sovereign countries that can, bicker about a horn, right? In a much more equal way. And the same with like war booties that the Swedes have been taking from Poland. Well, you can negotiate that through international relations in different ways, right? So that's a very different situation when it comes to the Sami. They do not have the same power and agency as a Danish state does, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think he was just meaning on a more general term rather than specifically with the Sami. But I think too, because we're kind of getting over an hour and a half now. I think to maybe try and wrap it up is that everything or each case should probably be looked at as an individual. That you can't put any sort of blanket ban over this, like a blanket idea over all this. It has to be each case of each item should be looked at and the culture and all these different aspects taken into consideration, and then decide what happens. It's not just a case of you can just say everything goes back to one place, because everything has its own history and everything, and culture and borders and people and empires and kingdoms have all changed throughout human history.
And I think that also counts for very much for the intangible knowledge. And we didn't actually get so much into talking about how do we actually talk about those kind of culture that does have heavy or just ownership on them, and the ones that perhaps don't have ownership on them, because there's a lot of examples, and there's a lot of like just words, concepts that are floating around the world today. The word totem is an example of a word that comes from a specific people, but which is now today used globally. And through the English language, indigenous peoples from all over the world are using the word totem. It came from the Anishinaabe language, and you know, and I mean, we need to decide, okay, so is it usable or is it not usable, or is it usable for some and not for others, and what are the criteria for which a word like that can be used? And if you can't use the word totem, if you're a white person, then what word should we use? Should we call it other than human kinship relation, or whatever? You know, there's this huge weight of how to consider ownership and exchange. Mm-hmm. Actually, we didn't reach that far, but it was nice. It was
no, you're totally right. I mean, and there are also, you know, so many examples of similar kinds of concepts in immaterial culture around the world, right? I mean, we have been using shamanism to describe Noir de Water, and that's, you know, reductive in a way, right? It's using that word is taking out some of the meaning that is otherwise present in the Sami language concerning this particular practice, right? And the word itself, shamanism, you know, originates in Siberia with Russian anthropologists looking at the Evenki and hearing them saying samami, which means to see in their language, and then transposing that on these many different diverse indigenous practices, right? So there's definitely there's a lot of problems associated with the language that we're using, right?
And that's probably counts for every single word in our language. Like we because we are the product of a history of power abuse and violence. And yeah, I think the English language is a good example. About 70% appropriation, and a lot of it probably appropriated from the most powerful people and in all kinds of convoluted ways. And I think, yeah, I don't know.
It's a really tough topic. You know,
I think when it comes to shamanism, we have to acknowledge that it's a wrong word, but still it is the word that most people understand when they hear it, or they have some kind of idea or grasp on what are you doing while I'm working with shamanism. Okay, so there's this guy jumping around with a drum and
no, that's a really good point. Yeah,
perfect. Should we wrap this one up, because I imagine we could go another 2 hours and never get to a solution with this one. And we've got our story time to record after this one. Kyrre, I mean, I'm sorry for butchering your name the whole way through. I'm just a moron and terrible at pronouncing names. But we would love to have you back on and do an episode on the Sami. If you would come back on, and we can really delve deep into that and get a a good understanding of the culture and what it is, and go further into what happened. Yeah, I'd love to learn more, and I'm sure Matthias would welcome you back anytime as well.
Absolutely, yeah, that would be an awesome episode.
And Rune, obviously you're welcome back anytime.
Awesome to see you guys, and awesome to see you for the first time, Kyrre. One day we will hang out.
Well, we will
for sure, man.
Do you, Kyrre, do you have anywhere people can find you, follow you, I guess, take an interest in this, or even if you want to maybe pull people in the right direction of where they can learn about the Sami culture?
Well, search the internet. I would say Google it, which will bring you a lot of information. Especially if you go into some museum pages, you will kind of get a dense kind of the story, a little bit longer than we had time to hear.
Yeah.
I guess people can reach me on Facebook if they want to talk to me.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have Instagram, maybe?
No, not. I have one, but it's kind of I use it for my own personal.
Fair enough.
Stuff. So, but my Facebook is public. I can put it in the chat.
We'll put it in the show notes of the episode as well. Rune, where can everybody find you and your wonderful work?
You can find me on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere on these the whole social media scape. Just search for Nordic Animism and you find me.
There you go. Matthias, go on.
Well, unlike Rune, you can only find me on Instagram.
Are you really priding yourself of going off grid there?
Oh yes, and one day I'm just gonna disappear entirely. Like I'm going to be like Bartur Snæfellsás and just like walk up on the mountain and then disappear under a glacier at some point. become a local deity.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
A land spirit.
So if you enjoy the show, please take a minute to leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review. Like we say, every week it helps us bump up the ratings, helps people find us, helps people know that if they're going to enjoy the show or not. If you want to support us a little bit further, Patreon is always the best way. We record a bonus episode every week. One week it'll be the Vikings watch along, where me and Matthias sit down and watch an episode of the Vikings series and let you know our thoughts, what we think, what's real, what's not real. And it's a good time. And then the other week we do a story time episode where Jonas Lorentzen comes on and narrates one of the sagas. He puts on a host of different voices, and honestly, they're really good fun. Just for those episodes alone, it's worth the Patreon subscription, in my opinion. You get the full back catalogue as well, so you can sign up for a month, listen to them all, see if you like them. If you don't like them, you can cancel it. You're only going to get charged for the 1 month. So go and check it out. Like I say, it really helps me and Matthias keep growing this. And the bigger it gets, the more time we can commit and donate to it, because we're not having to be distracted by other things to make money, I guess. Kyrre, Rune, thank you very much. This was fun. I don't think we said anything too bad. I think we're all going to be okay come Thursday, I hope.
I hope so too. Otherwise, Shan will probably tell us that was stupid, Matthias, or something like that. I don't know.
I think it's a good thing to start a discussion about it, and even joke about it, and acknowledge that we might not have the answer to some definition of these things, but at least we are discussing it without start throwing you're a white guy, you're doing cultural appropriation
absolutely
in each other's faces. We kind of have started something which might not be finished ever, but
no, I think that's an extremely important point. Thing that debates on important matters, they have to be joyful a little bit. That you have to be a little bit shooting the shit and smile, because if not, I don't think you're really learning. This is something I ripped from Tyson. I appropriated from Tyson Junkerporter's work. That he has this point. You have, when you are laughing and having a good time, that's when the shit in here is actually working. And I think it's really dangerous for the respect and in general kindness of the world when, for instance, progressive, kind, leftist positions lose their laughter and their joy.
No, I mean that's.
Just want to say that.
I kind of feel like it is something that you see in many indigenous cultures, that, you know, working out big issues and really big problems with laughter is a very common phenomenon, and that's definitely something we've lost in the Western culture these days.
And also, I guarantee there will be people who listen to this when it comes out on Thursday, and they will learn a lot, because it's not something maybe they've listened to before, spoken about, and just kind of, it's just a term they've heard, and they will learn things. I've learned something, you know. I wasn't sure what to do with the items. Kyrre told me in 2 seconds make a copy of them, but it's funny, but sometimes you don't understand the most obvious things until somebody points them out to you. And I was genuinely in a position of like, what do you do with them? Maybe put up a plaque of them. And then as soon as you said it, I was like, you know what? If they were in a position to steal these things, then they can pay to make a copy and give them back. And that makes absolute perfect sense. But I just didn't think of it because it had never been said to me before. And sometimes you need the most obvious things pointed out, and you go, you know what? Maybe I should have thought of that before.
Exactly, and there needs to be also room for, you know, not having the knowledge or the particular mechanisms and to get to that point, you know, and also.
Did you just politely call me dumb?
No.
I feel like you very politely just called me an idiot.
I actually, what I did say was that there needs to be space for everybody to be an idiot once in a while.
All right,
and the rest of us being, you know, forgiving about that.
He's pulling your leg, Mathias.
let's wrap this one up. Like I say, we have to go. Thank you very much.
Thank
and like I say, you're welcome back anytime, and I'm sure we can delve back into this again in the future.